The world is not at peace. This might come as news to some people who are experiencing the sweet, peaceful California sun or the deep, serene Floridian waters, but it's true. We're not just talking about the Ukrainian war either. Disastrous events are happening all across the globe, some of which you might not even have heard of.
There was an escalation in Nagorno-Karabakh, continued violence in Ethiopia, and obviously Putin's invasion of Ukraine.
A drone strike hit Moscow. This time, 2 non-residential office buildings were attacked. People in Odessa removed rubble from a Russian bombing of the historic Transfiguration Cathedral.
There's growing fear that intensifying clashes in Sudan between the army and paramilitary forces risks turning into an all-out civil war.
At present, over 30 armed conflicts are happening across the world. Yes, you heard that right, over 30. These range from terrorist insurgencies in Cameroon, ethnic violence in South Sudan, drug wars in Mexico, and civil wars in Syria. It's all a cocktail of violence and war. All this makes you realize that war can come to your doorstep at any time, from anywhere at all. This makes you wonder, can the United States of America be invaded and overrun much like certain areas we're seeing worldwide? Is it possible at all for the USA to fall victim and have the land of the home and the brave be taken by force and have you, its residents, become prisoners in your own home? That seems like a discussion worth exploring, so let's dive into that. But just before we jump into the meat of it all, please help us wage war on the YouTube algorithm by liking and commenting on this video. Recently, our outspoken educational videos on world matters like this one have been shadow banned by the you-know-who algorithm, resulting in very limited coverage and reach. Videos that usually get millions of views are now being suppressed to hurt the channel. Your likes and comments will go a long way in helping us stay in the fight so we can keep making these videos for our community. Okay? Let's get back to the basics. The USA is a proud and strong nation that has had quite a past, one stained by war and bloodshed. Americans have fought in many wars, ranging from those fought abroad and those fought at home. Like most wars, each war was fought for its own unique reasons that each side felt justified in. Before we talk about the why-nots of America being invaded, we need to start by diving into some of the wars that the US fought. This will give us a healthy understanding of the military past of the nation. That can then become the bedrock of the reasons we will cover in a few minutes. Understanding America's involvement in a few wars it took part in since its independence will give us depth as we speak on how it has never been invaded. What we can guarantee you is this: few nations have a military history like the US. Let's look into some of that history now, shall we? Let's start by going back in time, like way back in time. We're talking Independence Days. We might as well start at the very beginning when revolts started in the quest for America's freedom. You see, the British Navigation Acts, the closing of Western lands, the restricting of the colonial currency, the Quartering Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Acts enacted by the British Parliament contributed to the revolution of colonists. In 1773, the British Parliament permitted the East India Company to sell tea in the colonies at very low prices, which resulted in the Boston Tea Party. The response of the British Parliament was the Intolerable Acts and the Quebec Act in 1774. In September of the same year, the First Continental Congress was held in Philadelphia. This was to be followed by the start of the Revolutionary War soon after in 1775. A year later, the United States declared its independence. The war between British and American troops continued on, however, culminating in the Treaty of Paris in 1773 that saw that the independence of the 13th colonies was recognized by Great Britain. That was how the War of Independence ended, but that was far from being the only war that the US was to be involved in. In fact, just a few short years later, the United States itself declared war on Britain in 1812. The war was primarily over the impressment of American sailors by the British Navy, as well as disagreements over trade, Western expansion, and Native American policy. It's hard to tally a winner or loser in this war. On one hand, you can argue that the Americans performed better at sea. American ships won several battles against British warships and captured several British trade vessels. The Americans continued to ably combat the formidable Royal Navy throughout the war. On the other hand, Britain effectively won the War of 1812 by successfully defending its North American colonies. This in addition to the struggles that Great Britain was having with France at the time. The war eventually ended with the exchange of ratifications of the Treaty of Ghent. You think that was the last time America had to fight in the 1800s, but it wasn't. When the US took Texas and annexed it as its territory a few decades later, Mexico wasn't happy. Mexico stipulated that the land was theirs and that America was invading. In retaliation, Mexicans attacked U.S. troops in 1846, resulting in the U.S. declaring war on Mexico. In the fighting that followed, the mostly volunteer United States military secured control of Mexico after a series of battles, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed on February 2, 1848. This war was the first large-scale success of a United States military force on foreign soil. In all fairness, it was less of a war and more of a brutal spanking. Despite losing, Mexico did receive some financial compensation as part of the agreed treaty with the U.S. They received about $18 million in compensation for the lands that the U.S. took. You see, the peace pact set a border between Texas and Mexico and ceded California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, most of Arizona and Colorado, and parts of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Wyoming to the United States. This transfers to the United States control also cut the territorial size of Mexico in half. Yes, that's right. Mexico suffered a big hit, but oh well, at least it got some money out of it, right? On the surface, the war's outcome seemed like a true bonanza for the United States. However, the acquisition of so much territory with the issue of slavery unresolved lit the fuse that eventually set off the Civil War in 1861. That one was a big one. The Civil War began after decades of simmering tensions between northern and southern states over slavery, states' rights, and westward expansion. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 caused 7 southern states to break off and form the Confederate States of America, and 4 more states soon joined them. Since President Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party were against the expansion of slavery, the southern states saw it fit to declare their secession from the Union, leading to war. This war was probably the deadliest in American history. The Union won, and the Confederate armies surrendered in 1865. This war is perhaps one of the most iconic wars after the War of Independence, as this war ended the practice of slavery here within the United States. To date, the conflict was the costliest and deadliest war ever fought on American soil, with some 620,000 of 2.4 million soldiers killed, millions more injured, and much of the South left in ruin. Other than the war itself, the other historical thing to happen is that on the eve of victory, the Union lost its great leader, President Lincoln. An actor and Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth assassinated President Lincoln at Ford's Theater in Washington on April 14th. We should probably make a video on that, but that will be quite the deep dive. Or you can watch the Abraham Lincoln movie. Just don't believe everything you see. So we had 1812, 1861, and next we had 1898. Yes, America fought a war in 1898, and it was called the Spanish-American War. The war originated in the Cuban struggle for independence from Spain, which began in February 1895. The Cuban conflict was injurious to U.S. investments in the island, which were estimated at $50 million, and almost ended U.S. trade with Cuban ports, normally valued at $100 million annually. On the insurgent side, the war was waged largely against property and led to the destruction of sugarcane and sugar mills. Of more importance in its effect on U.S. monetary interests was the appeal to American humanitarian sentiment. Under the Spanish commander, Captain General Valeriano, nicknamed the Butcher, Cubans were herded into so-called reconcentration areas in and around the larger cities. Those who remained at large were treated as enemies. Spanish authorities made no adequate provision for shelter, food, sanitation, or medical care for the reconcentrados, thousands of whom died from exposure, hunger, and disease. These conditions were graphically portrayed for the U.S. public by sensational newspapers. Notably, Joseph Pulitzer New York World and William Randolph Hearst recently founded New York Journal. Humanitarian concern for the suffering Cubans was added to the traditional American sympathy for colonial people struggling for independence. While these aspects of the war created a widespread popular demand for action to halt it, the U.S. was faced with the necessity of patrolling coastal waters to prevent gun running to the insurgents, and by demands for aid from Cubans who had acquired U.S. citizenship and then had been arrested by Spanish authorities for participating in the rebellion. The war that followed between the U.S. and Spain was, for lack of a better word, pathetically one-sided. Spain was in no sense prepared for war with a formidable power. The U.S. military was equally unprepared, but the outcome of the war was largely dependent on sea power, and in this element, the United States completely outclassed its opponent. Spain had nothing to match the 4 new battleships, Indiana, Iowa, Massachusetts, and Oregon, which formed the backbone of the North Atlantic Squadron. The war ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in August 1998. The U.S. gained the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam, yet another massive gain from the war. At this point, you're probably thinking, well, that was the last of the U.S. wars in a while, but sadly no. By the time the Spanish-American War ended, the First World War was right around the corner. We bet you need no introduction to that. The United States remained neutral at the beginning of the First World War. Individual Americans supported one side or the other, although the majority were sympathetic to the Allies. Many contributed to relief efforts. Others volunteered as ambulance drivers or nurses, or even as pilots and soldiers. However, most agree with President Woodrow Wilson's commitment to keeping the U.S. out of the fighting. Overseas, the war continued through 1915 and 1916. On the Western Front, that is, in France and Belgium, the fighting bogged down into trench warfare, with combatants on both sides living and dying below ground in squalid, filthy conditions. Most of the other battlefronts also remained deadlocked. The opposing armies threw millions of men at each other in massive battles, and technological advances provided new ways of inflicting death and damage, but neither side was able to gain the upper hand. Some Americans felt that their country had a duty to step in to stop the slaughter, but most believed that the pointless carnage proved that the U.S. had been right to stay out of the war. This was to change in 1917, however, when a series of events changed American attitudes. Earlier in the war, Germany had prohibited its submarines from sinking civilian and neutral ships, due largely to U.S. protests. In February 1917, it resumed unrestricted submarine warfare against all ships in the war zone. Shortly after, an intercepted German telegram revealed a plan to offer Mexico territory it had lost to the U.S. during the Mexican-American War in exchange for its support. These are the areas of Texas, California, and the like that we mentioned earlier in the video. These events finally brought the U.S. into the war on the side of the Allies on April 6, 1917. In the months that followed, over 4 million Americans of all backgrounds entered military service and prepared to go overseas. The U.S. government took an active role in mobilizing American industry and society in support of the war effort. In France, General John Blackjack Pershing led the effort to organize millions of incoming American troops into an effective fighting force. Meanwhile, German successes on other battlefronts allowed them to focus their efforts on the Western Front. In the spring of 1918, the Germans launched a major series of attacks, finally breaking the stalemate and advancing all along the Western Front. U.S. forces were thrown into action and helped turn back the German assault. Over the summer and into the fall of 1918, the Americans played an emerging role as the Allies finally pushed back the Germans on the Western Front. The Allies also advanced on other battlefronts. One by one, the Central Powers surrendered until Germany stood alone. Finally, on the morning of November 11, 1918, Germany signed an armistice that brought the fighting to an end. The mobilization of the U.S. economy and society and the service and sacrifice of millions of Americans helped bring an end to the war and laid the foundation for the emergence of the U.S. as a world superpower later in the 20th century. This legacy was to be set in stone just a few short years later in 1939, when the Second World War began. After the war had been going on for some years, with the U.S. trying to maintain neutrality, Japan made the mistake of dragging the U.S. in by attacking the United States base at Pearl Harbor. This led to the United States declaring war on Japan on December 7, 1941. 3 days later, after Germany and Italy declared war on it, the United States became fully engaged in the Second World War, something Japan was to fully regret. The U.S. involvement in the Second World War was quickly followed by a massive mobilization effort. With millions of men and women serving overseas in the nation's armed forces, most of those who remained at home dedicated themselves to supporting the war effort by whatever means was available to them. Women, who had worked as homemakers or had held jobs outside military-related industries, took jobs in aircraft manufacturing plants, munitions plants, military uniform production factories, and so on. As the need for steel and other resources increased, American citizens participated in rationing programs, as well as recycling and scrap metal drives. Americans also supported the war effort with their hard-earned dollars by purchasing Liberty bonds. Sold by the U.S. government, the bonds raised money for the war and helped the bond purchasers feel they were doing their part in the war effort. The U.S. entry into the war helped to get the nation's economy back on its feet following the Depression. Although just 10 years earlier, jobs were very difficult to come by, there were now jobs for nearly everyone who wanted one. With the creation of 17 million new jobs during the war, workers were afforded the opportunity to pay off old debts, as well as to begin saving some of their earnings. Not all Americans remaining at home gained favorably from the war. Fearing that Japan might invade the west coast of the United States, the government rounded up thousands of Japanese Americans who lived on the west coast and confined them to internment camps. By 1948, when the internment program ended, tens of thousands of Japanese had suffered as internees. In addition, German Americans, Italian Americans, Hungarians, Romanians, and Bulgarians were also interned. These groups were marginalized, and the return to life after the war was very difficult. Germany eventually surrendered on the 8th of May 1945, but Japan stayed in the fight. It wasn't until America had dropped nukes on both Hiroshima and Nagasaki that Japan eventually surrendered on September 2, 1945, and the Second World War came to an end. The war cost the lives of more than 330,000 American soldiers, with many being more permanently injured or maimed. In the aftermath of the Warsaw Pact and NATO were created, and the Cold War began. The reign of the United States as the foremost global superpower then began. There are 3 more wars that we would like to talk about and we feel are pivotal to mention. What we want you to know is how in all these wars, the US has never been truly invaded in the sense of the word, and how casualties have never been so severe they warranted defeat in war. The next war worth mentioning that the US was a part of was the Korean War of 1950. The Korean War was a conflict that emerged after World War II. The Empire of Japan had occupied the Korean peninsula during the war. After Japan's defeat, the victorious Allies split the peninsula on the 38th parallel. US troops occupied the southern part, while Soviet troops occupied the northern part. The two Koreas engaged in a border conflict, which escalated when North Korea invaded South Korea on June 25th. On June 27, 1950, the United States officially entered the Korean War. The US supported the Republic of Korea, commonly called South Korea, in repelling an invasion from the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, commonly called North Korea. The Korean War in reality became a proxy war for the Cold War. The West, that is the United Kingdom and the US, supported by the United Nations, supported South Korea. On the other hand, Communist China and the Soviet Union supported North Korea intensely. The Korean War ended 3 years later with millions of casualties. The war ended with virtually no change in the border. The Korean peninsula is still divided, but the Korean Demilitarized Zone was established. The Demilitarized Zone is occupied by military personnel from both North and South Korea to date. It's difficult to say that the Korean War is over, but it seems to be largely a stalemated affair. Tensions due to the lack of proper resolution still affect relationships to this day. The Korean War is also known as the Forgotten War because it was sandwiched between the Second World War and the next war to discuss, the Vietnam War. This one is quite interesting.
We can't reach those big guns and they just keep dropping in. There's nothing you can do. It's like being a big bullseye on top of a hill.
I saw 4 armed enemy soldiers the first 8 months I was in Vietnam.
The city almost completely destroyed. A city which has withstood 3 major communist assaults.
It's impossible to wage guerrilla warfare against the largest air power in the history of warfare.
Communism should be stopped somewhere, and it might as well be in Vietnam.
The Vietnam War was fought between the Communist forces of North Vietnam, Viet Cong, Khmer Rouge, the People's Republic of China, USSR, North Korea, and Pathet Lao, and the anti-communist forces of the US, South Vietnam, South Korea, Australia, Philippines, Thailand, New Zealand, the Kingdom of Laos, and the Khmer Republic. Yes, we know, it was quite an intense war. Essentially, the war became yet another front for the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, as the two superpowers came head-to-head in the jungles of Vietnam. At the heart of the conflict was the desire of North Vietnam, which had defeated the French colonial administration of Vietnam in 1954, to unify the entire country under a single communist regime, modeled after those of the Soviet Union and China. The South Vietnamese government, on the other hand, fought to preserve a Vietnam more closely aligned with the West. The map of the divided nation looked like this, with the South and North each representing different ideals and fighting against each other. How did America come into play in this? Well, there was the belief that if one country fell to communism, it was likely that the neighboring one would also fall, similar to a row of dominoes falling over. This had happened in Eastern Europe after 1945. China had become communist in 1949, and communists were in control of North Vietnam. The USA was afraid that communism would spread to South Vietnam and then the rest of Asia. To ensure the halting of communism, it decided to send money, supplies, and military advisors to help the South Vietnamese government. U.S. military advisors, present in small numbers throughout the 1950s, were introduced on a large scale beginning in 1961, and active combat units were introduced in 1965. By 1969, more than 500,000 U.S. military personnel were stationed in Vietnam. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union and China poured weapons, supplies, and advisors into the North, which in turn provided support, political direction, and regular combat troops for the campaign in the South. The costs and casualties of the growing war proved too much for the United States to bear, and U.S. combat units were withdrawn by 1973. In 1975, South Vietnam fell to a full-scale invasion by the North. The US had failed in its agenda, and Vietnam had been conquered under the Vietnamese. The human costs of the long conflict were harsh for all involved. Not until 1995 did Vietnam release its official estimate of war dead, as many as 2 million civilians on both sides and some 1.1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters. Vietnam emerged from the war as a potent military power within Southeast Asia, but its agriculture, business, and industry were disrupted. Large parts of its countryside were scarred by bombs and defoliation and laced with landmines, and its cities and towns were heavily damaged. All this was mostly due to the US's choice of warfare. The US military made use of chemical warfare by utilizing napalm and Agent Orange chemicals, the impacts of which were disastrous and led to damaged land, as we just explained a minute ago. In the international arena, the US's reputation was heavily tarnished. To this day, the Vietnam War remains one of the collective feelings of shame of the nation. The US was criticized for having supported a corrupt government on top of its brutal tactics, which in context were now tactics used on innocent people. To add to that, approximately 58,000 American soldiers were killed, and hundreds of thousands more were wounded and maimed. Oh, and did we mention that between 1965 and 1973, the USA spent more than $120 billion on the war? This massive spending is in part what led to widespread inflation, which was further worsened by a worldwide oil crisis in 1973 and skyrocketing fuel prices. Also psychologically, the fact that the USA, the great superpower, had lost to a much smaller and less powerful country was greatly demoralizing. There was a loss of confidence in American military abilities. This confidence has since been gotten back, but the shame of the war still lingers. However, notice that the fighting in Vietnam was not an invasion of the US, and the war there was far from the US showcasing its full strength. This brings us to another war that, well, still has torn opinions, to say the least. Yes, we're talking about the 20-year-long war in the Middle East. We're sure this one needs no explanation, but to put it briefly, the United States went to Afghanistan in 2001 to wage a necessary war of self-defense. On September 11, 2001, like most already know, the Al-Qaeda terrorists attacked the US in what was to be called the 9/11 attacks. The Taliban was able to plan and execute such a horrific attack because their Taliban hosts had given them a safe haven in Afghanistan. The war that followed lasted for 20 years and had untold damage and costs. Let's talk numbers, shall we? The US government spent $2.3 trillion, and the war led to the deaths of 2,324 US military personnel, 3,917 US contractors, and 1,144 allied troops. For Afghans, the statistics were nearly unimaginable. 70,000 Afghan military and police deaths, 46,319 Afghan civilians, and some 53,000 opposition fighters killed. Almost 67,000 other people were killed in Pakistan in relation to the Afghan war as well. Despite all these losses and expenditures, the US was unable to eliminate the Taliban through military means, and so turned to diplomacy to end the conflict. These efforts culminated in the US-Taliban deal in February 2020, which stipulated the withdrawal of all US troops from Afghanistan by 2021. That is basically how it ended, but there's a ton of politics in that to unravel. Let's move on to the last war, and perhaps one of the ones most worth mentioning. That is the Iraq War. Operation Iraqi Freedom, later renamed Operation New Dawn in September 2010, began in 2003 with the invasion of Iraq by a US-led coalition that overthrew the government of Saddam Hussein. The conflict continued for nearly a decade, as insurgent fighters resisted the occupying forces and the post-invasion Iraq government. In 2007, following a decline in insurgent violence, the US gradually began to reduce its military presence, and the last US troops exited on December 15, 2011, marking the end of the war. It was yet another expensive war whose impact has continued into yet another decade. In the summer of 2014, the Islamic State launched a military offensive in northern Iraq and declared a worldwide Islamic caliphate, leading to Operation Inherent Resolve, another military response from the United States and its allies. According to a 2019 US Army study, Iran emerged as the only victor of the war. What we want you to notice in all these American wars and conflicts over the years is how the US has never been properly invaded in the sense of the word. There are reasons why this is so. We'll break down these reasons right now. The first and obvious reason can be summarized in 2 words: military strength. There really is no other way of putting this. The United States of America is by far the most powerful military on the face of the earth. It is the most armed, most trained, most funded military machine. Between the various branches of the United States military, the force is nigh undefeatable. Although other countries may have more troops, the size of America's army combined with its advanced technology makes it incredibly difficult to defeat. This is one of the biggest reasons why another country could not invade the US. Realize this. In order to launch an invasion of America, an enemy country would need to defeat most of the US military. There is almost no country in the world that could do this. In fact, you can argue that most coalitions of nations could still be unable to defeat the US alone. All this just factors into conventional weaponry. When you start to factor in things like the US nuclear arsenal, the gap widens even more. America has well over 4,000 nuclear warheads, more than any other country on the planet. If the US was invaded, it could use these to defend itself, essentially annihilating any country that attempted to land troops on its territory. America also has military bases all over the world, further making an invasion of the mainland United States practically impossible. What we find interesting is that most of what we know covers the declassified version of the US military arsenal. There are nations like Russia who thought they had equipment far ahead of the pack until the US showed them otherwise in the Ukrainian war. Let's look at one example. Russia boasted of the prowess of the Kinzhal missile. This Kinzhal missile is one of the latest and most advanced Russian weapons. Its military says the air-launched ballistic missile has a range of up to 1,250 miles and flies at 10 times the speed of sound, making it hard to intercept. President Vladimir Putin has in the past boasted that this missile cannot be shot down by any of the world's air defense systems. The US Patriot system, however, proved this otherwise when it shot down said unstoppable missile. One can only wonder what else the US has up at the storage that it will not share with its other friends. It's hard to not imagine the presence of some crazy futuristic weapons when the US spends over $876 billion on its military in 2022. Just look at this picture to see how far off its nearest competitor was. So yes, the might of the US military is more than enough to thwart any enemy that might dare to invade. To add spice to the soup, the United States is leaps and bounds ahead of everyone so far as technological weaponry is concerned. America is among the most technologically advanced countries in the world. Its military is equipped with the latest technology, and this makes it difficult to defeat. There is no army in the world as technologically advanced as the Americans, and this would make an invasion of the US almost impossible. Realize that many of the world's leading technology companies are American. Now imagine when the sole focus of that is shifted to military concerns. The US leads the world in innovation and the development of high-tech industries, giving it a foothold and upper hand in such matters. So with the skill set and the resources, this provides America with enormous wealth, as well as the resources needed to defend the country. And besides all that, significant parts of the world economy depend on US companies and American technology. An invasion of the US would cause enormous disruption to the world economy, and major world powers are unlikely to let this happen. All this can count as the first deterrent, but that alone cannot be the only reason. We need more to safely conclude that the US can't be invaded. Let's move on to reason number 2. This reason might be more of a deterrence than the first, and that is the US's geographical advantages in size. You see, history will tell you that the smaller the nation, the easier it is to invade. That is because blitz movements, military campaigns, and supply chains can move in coordinated manners as enemy troops cross the nation to suppress key targets. However, none of this works on the US. For lack of a better word, the United States is gigantic. The continental US is 9.834 million square kilometers. To show how big this is, realize that Europe is approximately 10.18 million square kilometers, making Europe only 4% larger than the United States. So just imagine trying to invade the whole of Europe in one go. The reality of this matter is that a country that big is very difficult to invade. No army in the world is powerful enough to launch an invasion of a country as big as America. This is just talking about an invasion alone, and nothing of the actual occupation of that land. The US is simply too large for an invasion force to occupy. There are too many major cities and large expansive rural areas for an army to control. Any invasion of the US would fail drastically as the US is so large. The size itself is a deterrence for any invading force silly enough to consider invading. If it were just size alone, then it would be one thing. In the case of the US, however, it's both size and geography. The geography of the US makes it a haven for defenders and a nightmare for invaders. Let us explain. The US is sandwiched between oceans. To the east and west of the United States are oceans. Both the Pacific and North Atlantic Oceans are huge and would be impossible for an invading army to cross them unseen. By the time any invading fleet has crossed the Pacific and North Atlantic Oceans, the threat of war would be realized, and by the time they try to land at any port, the US will be well prepared to give them a good old American welcome. Have we also mentioned that the US just so happens to have the strongest navy in the world? No army is definitely crossing these oceans without being crushed before they even get the opportunity to land. So yes, invading the US from the west or east is a non-starter. How about the other directions? Well, let's talk about the north. Up north of America is Canada. Canada on its own is a force to be reckoned with, and it has strong ties and alliances with the US, something we'll get to soon. To get to the US, you would have to have crossed thousands of miles of Arctic ice with virtually no opposition. That, my friends, is a fantasy. The Canadian Army is a very capable fighting force, and very few armies would want to face it, let alone have to invade the US afterward. Our point is, it would be extremely difficult for an invading army to attack the US from the north. How about the south? Well, the south of the United States is Mexico. This is yet another country that the United States has several economic pacts and agreements with. Even if somehow an enemy was to try and cross through Mexico, having defeated a capable Mexican army, then the invading force would have to go through the US-Mexican border, which is a desert area that is hard to move an army across. If an army was to attempt this, it would become easy pickings for a very capable US Air Force to rain hellfire on them while they are exposed with no shelter. It would be a massacre. Fine. Let's assume by some miracle an army has managed to defy the Pacific Ocean, the North Atlantic Ocean, the Canadian border, and the Mexican border, and they get to mainland US untouched. Then are they safe? No. No, they are not. Internally, the United States has mountains, grasslands, deserts, and forests. The tundra of the United States makes it easy to defend and hard to attack. Moving armies through the vast areas of random geologies will be a nightmare for any commander whilst providing for various traps for an acclimated and awaiting US force. An attempt to invade the US would be a bloodbath if nothing else, due to the geography. So yes, invading the US is a job and a half. We've talked about the US military, we've talked about the geography, and now let's move on to the next reason why invading the US would be tough. Well, it's because of you. Yes, you. Well, we're speaking to the American portion of our viewers at this time. The United States has a large and very patriotic population, about 340 million people to be exact. This makes the US the third most populated nation in the world, behind only India and China. Can you imagine trying to subdue 340 million unhappy people? We certainly can't. The scale of resistance and the size of the army needed to overcome it to gain control of the US is too large for any country. It's just too much. What makes the US population even more dangerous is the fact that the US population is, well, it's armed. Heavily armed at that. The US is so armed, gun control is a major topic in the US, and with several civilian deaths, discussions like this are always on the news.
President Biden reiterated a need for more gun reforms. He says there needs to be a ban on assault weapons.
The governor has mandated extra armed guards and other safety measures, but some want Texas to tighten its gun control laws too.
I don't think that the safety measures we have in place are enough to prevent something from happening.
We must establish the safest standards.
Putting to the side whichever side of the gun control debate you favor, in the context of this discussion, the arming of the US population is an important reason why the US would never be invaded. Other than the formal military itself, any army aiming to invade the US would be unable to overcome the entire population. This would mean there would also be resistance to any occupation, making it difficult to maintain. For a country like the US, whose population is nearly 340 million, filled with patriots armed to the teeth, you best believe suppressing rebellion and resistance groups will not be a walk in the path. Look at this article from Bloomberg. The US has more civilian-owned weapons than actual civilians themselves. If that is not a shocking statistic, we don't know what is. So yes, the population size and state of the US pretty much makes an invasion improbable, or at the very least, not worth it. If everything we've said has not convinced you that the United States of America cannot be invaded successfully, then you need to take a nap. All that working has fried your brain. Jokes aside, let us add one more cherry to the pie to solidify in your mind beyond doubt and reason that invading the US is suicide. 2 words: US allies.
He's been meeting with leaders from 9 countries on NATO's eastern flank.
The 2 leaders shook hands. Trump on South Korean soil, Kim Jong-un in the north.
It goes unsaid that the US has allies everywhere and very powerful allies at that. For starters, the United States is a member of NATO. For those who are not aware, NATO is a military alliance made up of 30 countries across North America and Europe. NATO provides a mutual defense guarantee to all countries, which means an attack on one is an attack on all. Any country that tries to invade America would have to go to war with all of NATO. That means invading the US will expose you to the arsenals of nations like Belgium, Canada, France, Italy, the United Kingdom, Turkey, Germany, and Spain. Do you really want all these nations to fight you at the same time? Yeah, we didn't think so. Russia is having a hard time with a NATO-funded Ukraine. What more when NATO gets to openly throw its weight into the mix? It will be a massacre. As well as being a member of NATO, the US has a range of alliances with other countries. Although the US is not a formal ally with all countries in Central and South America, its critical role in the region means that many of these countries would assist America if it was invaded. Mexico, for example, has not historically sided with countries that have wanted to attack the US. This has meant the United States couldn't be invaded from the southern border. Add all these allies to the United States' global power as an individual country, and what you have is quite the mixture. On the world stage, America is important culturally, diplomatically, and politically around the world. The global role of the US makes it hard to invade, and also means many countries would come to its aid. The US has made it a point to have an active role in international affairs, including holding a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. A country that is as crucial to the international system and integrated into world affairs is hard to invade because of its dominant role globally. Seems that the US has put itself in the best possible position. So, what's the verdict? Can the US truly be invaded successfully? We think not. Each of these factors on their own would be quite the deterrence, but added together, they are a danger sign. A warning to not attempt. We personally know some Texans out there that would relish the opportunity to unload some ammunition rounds on you if you were to ever try. Humor aside, the impact that a potential invasion of America would have around the world would be enormous. Many countries depend on the US for their security and many more, have crucial economic links with America. It is impossible to see how many countries in the world would allow an invasion of America to happen without intervening. We'll leave you to make your verdict, but we do have one question for you though. What country or countries do you think would be silly enough to attempt a modern-day US invasion? Lastly, we want to address some hate comments we've been getting. We're sure some of you guys have noticed that we recently released a free guide on how beginners can grow on YouTube. Following this, some people have commented that it's near impossible to get views on YouTube as a new channel. So today, we brought some evidence to prove the haters wrong. Here's a channel started just 4 months ago that's getting hundreds of thousands of views every upload. Here's another channel started 5 months ago that has had a video hit more 5 million views. These are just a few of many channels started recently who have gotten substantial views on YouTube. So don't believe the lie that it's too late to start on YouTube. If you are someone who has ever wanted to start a YouTube channel, right now is the best chance you have in front of you. And to help you get started, we've made a free 5-day YouTube guide. Just scan the QR code on screen or click the link in the description.